What I was just talking about is the two grand jury releases that have been ordered for next week. That's interesting, and it may involve some discovery, but we're not expecting that much. But your story for Blue Amp Media about Michael Wolff and the connection between Michael Wolff and Jeffrey Epstein and Steve Bannon.
Well, it's like everything with Jeffrey Epstein. It's just such a complicated web. The relationship that he held with Bannon was very parallel to the relationship he held with Michael Wolff. And then Michael Wolff was the go-between with everything. What I really tried to dig into is the early years, because Michael Wolff actually met Epstein probably around 2001, 2002. He flew with him to a TED conference in California with a bunch of authors and scientists, and was said to have felt very uncomfortable because he noticed that there were teenagers on the plane. But there's this kind of grouping of years in between that, and then when we start to see these emails where we don't really know what made them develop their relationship. But then we started to go into the Trump campaign, and that just fueled Michael Wolff's it was his just drive for life was this Trump campaign and taking down Donald Trump. And so at that point, everybody knew about Jeffrey Epstein. Everybody knew his reputation. He'd already gone to jail for those first 13 months. And so that was no surprise that was his background. And so Michael Wolff kind of had to make a decision between two evils, if you will. If he wants to take down Trump, then he has to be friends with Epstein in order to do it, because Epstein became this guy that he started talking to who had more information on Donald Trump than anyone else. And if he was going to write this book, then he needed to talk with Epstein. But originally, it was just writing a book about Epstein. That was his goal, was he was just going to write a book about Epstein. And it kind of went from there.
Then he found out that Epstein knew so much about Trump. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
When you say they had an earlier relationship or friendship, how far back are we talking about?
So we're talking, Michael Wolff is quoted as saying around 2001, I was researching TED conferences and when Epstein would have gone, and I found 2002, so around that time. But then in 2003, Wolff became this middleman for a sale of New York Magazine. Right. And he tried to sell it with a grouping of perfect people. If you want to think of this world of Jeffrey Epstein, we had Weinstein, Epstein, Donnie Deutsch. They tried to buy New York Magazine for $44 million, and they were outbid by a financier. It was kind of like, why was Michael Wolff pulling these people together to sell the newspaper? And then he also wanted to get a job at New York Magazine, which he then did not get. There's just another period of time after that where Epstein goes off, gets arrested, goes to jail. Michael Wolff is writing and bouncing around, and he wasn't writing a lot of books back then. Then all of a sudden they're back together and they're just full on buddies. And
so interesting, because he was full on buddies with Donald Trump too, and he was writing those books. He sure has the same sort of approach to his subjects. He's very friendly with them. He makes them feel like he's very much in the loop. He's on their side. The books sometimes reflect that, sometimes they don't. We'll talk a lot more about this later on, but I'm just curious, as a short answer from you, do you think Michael Wolff was just playing a role in order to ingratiate himself with Jeffrey Epstein, or was there actual sympathy for him or empathy for him or support for his cause, as it were?
I think it started out as journalism. I think he's a little bit cutthroat with his journalism. I think he became empathetic. I think it's very hard to spend that much time with a single person and not become bonded with them. And I've said that about different situations that I've written about. Toward the end, and one of his reasons for not wanting to release these interviews, because he has 100 hours of interviews, is he doesn't think that the public is ready for them, because he thinks that we're going to see a side of Jeffrey Epstein that we don't want to see, meaning that we're going to empathize with Jeffrey Epstein. We're going to see the regular guy, which makes me think that that's how he feels about him. And which I also think is a lame reason not to release them, because be that as
he's a regular guy and a nice guy, and he's energetic, then why not? Look, I think there's a lot to that. Actually, in researching and writing about Jeffrey Epstein, there's a lot of times where you think, well, why is he behaving that way? He doesn't seem like that bad a guy. And you certainly see it in the algorithm, which we'll talk about later on, which he had on his chalkboard in Little St. James. You know, he left that behind on purpose. That wasn't an accidental leave behind. Right. He wrote that for all of us to discover what he was doing. We also know that when he was imprisoned, he was talking a lot. He was giving away the details. It's probably the reason he died. Did he this is a much more complicated story than just about girls and blackmail, obviously. It's a lot more to it than that. We'll talk all about that later on because I've got to talk about the algorithm. We're going to hear lots more about Michael Wolff and see the emails that Jeffrey and Epstein and Wolff and Bannon had together. So it's going to be really interesting. But I also want to talk about this deadline. So we've got 9 days now till the next Friday, 8 days, let's call it. It's going to be a big day. Now, do you actually think those records are going to be coming out next Friday, the 19th? Or do you think this is just going to be another late point? Because I'm really interested in that.
I think that until this time, with Trump being indicted on 34 counts and how many times that date got pushed back, I don't really rest my heart on deadlines and dates with him because I just think the rules don't apply. I would hope, because this is something that's very bipartisan and because it obviously affects his image if he pushes it back, which is the main thing he worries about, I would hope that we'd at least get something by that date. But I don't know. But now we also have the letter that came in from the survivors today saying that they want to do an investigation to make sure that nothing has been inappropriately redacted and removed, and to protect people who aren't innocent victims. So that's something that they may use as a reason to push it back.
Well, I think they'll be trying that. I think the judge tried to deal with that today. They're trying to say the names of the survivors are so important and we have to protect them. Of course, the DOJ is now arguing that, having released a lot of the names themselves. So it's...
Yes. They don't care about the names. They have, even in Ghislaine Maxwell's interviews with Todd Blanche, they were dropping names of Jane Does that they were not redacting. And they had multiple chances to hear it and see it and transcribe it to know that that was a Jane Doe, because he had just said the Jane Doe, such and such, and then she said the name. So they don't care about that. That's not their reasoning. But if that's an excuse for them to put it off, then they'll use that.
In July, we heard from Attorney General Pam Bondi, and she announced then no incriminating client list at all. Nothing was to be investigated. They thought it was case closed. We're all moving on. Now, that contradicted her earlier claim in February that there was a list that was sitting on her desk. So that was a contradiction. Then they backed off. So it's a February, there's a list. In July, there's no list. And then now there's a new investigation into a bunch of Democrats ordered by the president, who might have been involved with Epstein, but only Democrats, not anybody else involved from the Republican Party. That just smacks of a ruse. It seems to me like what they're going to be doing is saying, we can't release any of this stuff because these investigations are ongoing.
Right. So I have two thoughts about that. The first one, I've been very open the whole time to there being a large amount of Democrats in these files, and for them to be as equally culpable as Republicans, because it's very bipartisan, right? Bad people are just bad people. They don't generally sit on party lines. There's not a lot. It's a little surprising. There are some. Bill Gates is in there. Bill Clinton is in there. So for not doing terrible things, just in proximity more often than they needed to be. You have Kathy Rumler is in there, who worked under Obama, but really not a lot of people. But you also have to remember that it was at a time, and it's very hard to tell where people sit on party lines because they all hated Donald Trump. A Republican-Democrat thing, it was everybody really, really wanted him out of office in these emails. You have that, but then when you cut to the idea of a client list, it's so heavily weighted in semantics about what a list is. Is it a Rolodex? Is it a cell phone? Is it just knowledge of people that have been written down or can be remembered or are living in these files as emails and as videos and as interactions and depositions? That is a list. It just means all the people who are involved. It doesn't mean that there was just like a list tacked to his wall of all his clients. It means that we have however many files, 100,000 files, filled with people who have evidence against them for wrongdoings in this case. That is the list.
Well, it's so right, because we're not going to get, and I think people are expecting this, names of people who have been with underage girls, and they're going to be secretly
listed out,
stealing these girls, kidnapping them, and hiding them somewhere. I don't think that's what we're going to see coming out.
You would write that down.
Yeah, there was some of that. There was, of course, some of that, but it was mostly for compromise, as I understand it. There's sort of three tracks of women that were involved with Epstein's operation. There were the models that you could hire for $100,000 for a shoot. That would also include some benefits, sex or whatever that they insisted. If you didn't do the sex, you wouldn't get the money. It was apparently one of the ways I understood it. The other track was actual spies like Lana and those others who came from Russia who worked around Epstein. They were planted by the Russian FSB, by the Kremlin. They were put there to do work for the Russians and with Epstein in the tech sector in Silicon Valley, in the AI world. That's one. And then there's a smaller group of young girls, younger women under the age of consent, who were used to traffic, to incriminate, to compromise people. It's a small group of people, actually. The large amount of it was just to spy on people. When we look at that algorithm, we look a little later on, this was an operation to compromise a lot of people in a lot of sectors, in finance, in politics, in the intellectual world, and in the physics world. And so a lot of what they were trying to do is just find information, find data, find knowledge, find technology. But also, when necessary, they could compromise people in order to say, hey, Bill Clinton, we don't want you to sign that deal with Rabin and Arafat. We don't want you to make that peace deal, and pressurizing him that way. This was not just about compromising people with young girls. And it wasn't just about some secret network of people who wanted to sleep with young girls. It was much more than that. This was a massive network and trying to commit a massive crime.
Yeah, and it's also true that Leslie Wexner, who owned all these properties before Epstein moved in, was highly paranoid. And for what, you can come to your own conclusions, but I think they're probably the same as my conclusions. But he's the person who was installing all these pinhole cameras in his apartments, in his house, and everywhere. And then Epstein then used them for what he used them. But there was a high level amount of paranoia from Leslie Wexner before all this started, and that Epstein stepped into that next role. And so why that is, I mean, I think you've probably picked up on a lot of that in your writing. There's reasons.
It's really interesting. I've told you the story before. I don't think I've spoken about it on camera here, but the idea of there was this lawyer involved with Wexner, Shapiro, who mysteriously died just as Jeffrey Epstein sort of arrived on the scene with Wexner in Ohio. Bob Fitrakis, who was a very famous reporter out of Ohio, exposed that story and exposed that police were really interested in Epstein's involvement in that murder and sort of Epstein's continued involvement with Wexner afterwards. It was very suspicious to them. It was Fitrakis who told me once that Jeffrey Epstein was a person of interest in the Robert Maxwell murder as well, which is consistent with some of the other stuff we've seen.
Right.
I wouldn't say he killed him. I wouldn't say he killed anyone, but he's a person of interest in new stuff. And the whole history of Wexner around Ohio is a sort of a big, mobbed up guy who did very wonderful things, very great things in business, because he had Victoria's Secret and he had the L brand and he had Abercrombie and Finch and a bunch of other things that he launched, but was also at the same time apparently involved in some mobby kind of activities with towing company, with Seagrams and the Bronfman family during the days when they were bootlegging. So this is how Wexner is very integral to the story. Wexner is very integral to Ohio, and Wexner is pretty much connected in various ways to organized criminal activity in some way.
But he's done such a good job of not looking like that. When people talk about him, they say, oh, he's just so gentle and he's so philanthropic. He's just living out his childhood dream in Ohio where he grew up. I think you and I both have talked about how strange the town of New Albany is, where he's living, and how it was basically built by him and controlled by Epstein, and a little bit Stepford if you go and you look at it, and yet nobody's talking about that. And it really feels like somebody decided that door is closed, and we're going to keep that door closed.
Wexner decides that. Wexner, every time I've mentioned his name, I hear about it in various ways. Even if I don't hear it, I feel it. There's always a reaction from him. And I don't know how old he is right now, but
93 years.
Yeah.
Very old.
He's old, but he controlled this large empire for a long time. And I think to a large extent, he's involved himself in politics for a long time. There are real questions around even the 2004 elections when Bush lost to Kerry that have been resurfacing recently. There's no doubt that the intersection of of the mob and politics and high fashion and all of that intersected through Leslie Wexner. While he was also a very good philanthropist, loved amongst many Ohioans and a great art collector amongst many other things, but he and a big lover of Israel, a big supporter of Israel, but also related to Epstein, funded Ehud Barak for $2.6 million. I really am interested in your take on Ehud Barak, because I know you were quite unhappy about him showing up last week at the book deal conference.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit more about, did you watch the podcast or you heard the podcast? Did they ask him about this?
So it was very interesting. So I'll back up a little bit. So the New York Times holds the Deal Book Summit every December, and it's the biggest talking point of the year for the New York Times. It's all the biggest CEOs. It's Elon. It's people who own like Bob Iger, David Zaslav, Prince Harry goes. Like this year they had Erica Kirk there. I mean, it's a very wide-ranging group of people. This year when I actually have worked at it since 2017. I work as the transcriber for all the panels. This year, when they dropped the list, I noticed that they had invited Ehud Barak, who's the former prime minister of Israel, to speak on the Israeli-Gaza conflict, which is a necessary conversation to have. It's very pertinent. Also, there's a lot of people who could have that conversation with the New York Times. It was not on purpose that they brought him. He is, if you have read Virginia Giuffre's book, in the chapter, and I forget what the chapter is called, but she discusses the well-known prime minister who was the most violent attack she ever experienced. And it was while she was still underage. She was on the island, broken ribs, couldn't breathe, was choked until she was unconscious. It's very, 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 very violent. And it was by a well-known prime minister. And it's documented that Epstein only ever met two prime ministers. He met Tony Blair once for a meeting for 30 minutes. And then he knew Ehud Barak very, very well over many years and spent lots of time with him. I asked one of my sources, I said, is this Ehud Barak? And they're like, yeah, that's Ehud Barak that she's describing. So I know that. And if I know that, the New York Times knows that. I emailed Andrew Ross Sorkin, who's the organizer for the event. And I said, hey, in the nicest way, what are you doing? Why is this the choice, especially with the Epstein files even if you don't believe that that's true, how involved he is in these Epstein files. All over, he's photographed, he's with the girls, he's staying at the apartments, he's staying in New Mexico. I said, what are you doing? You have an opportunity to, with a bullhorn, make a statement about the New York Times position and their stance on the Epstein file case. He basically just gave me a one-word answer, which normally he's a very wordy guy. He'll call and talk to me for 20, 30 minutes. I started contacting people about it, and Politico did a small write-up in one of their newsletters about it, but it's very small. They reached out to the New York Times. It ended up that Barak was not on the main stage, so he was not on the live stream that they do with the bigger speakers, but he was in a panel that was moderated by Nick Kristof, who's a really good writer and a really good guy. He's done a lot for child sex abuse and standing up for victims. I was wondering what was going on there, but it was a very private conversation. The whole conversation is not public. It has not been released. They released little tidbits of it, little talking points that you can find if you Google and look online. Nick did ask him about the Epstein files, and he said, you're described as being part of this sex trafficking. How do you feel about that? And Ehud Barak laughed, and he said, obviously that's not true, and now I regret ever having hung out with Jeffrey Epstein. And that was pretty much the gist of the questioning, and then they moved on to other things.
What do you make of that? I find it so incredulous that they laugh at these things. And they sort of clearly were involved and clearly were present. There's no doubt about that. Just to laugh at these victims' stories and survivors' stories seems to me as a real tell that they have, they don't care. They don't care.
Right.
And they never cared.
Just think of it as, you get a mosquito in your face and you keep wiping it away. And that's basically how he feels about the story and about the victims. I would assume that people who are as powerful as he is and as wealthy as he is, when you've heard about this thing for 30 years, you never think you're going to get caught for it. 30 years later, you're just, meh. What are they going to do to me? This clearly will never go anywhere. I think he doesn't care. He's just tired of hearing about it, so he doesn't care. Things will pop up like Virginia's book, but he's the former prime minister of Israel. He has so much protecting him. against people who really can't even afford a lawyer. It's a very uphill battle for any one of these survivors to come forward and try to confront a prime minister.
Difficult. It just amazes me the New York Times didn't ask the question, or at least they asked the question, but they didn't follow up in the way you'd expect them to. But this is a very serious issue, and for them to just invite him and to fail in their journalistic, no, we haven't heard the whole thing, maybe they did actually ask, but fail in their journalistic quest is a bit interesting. I want to play you a little bit, and I won't play you the whole lot because it's a bit too long, but there's a little bit here of Michael Wolff, and I was speaking to him a few weeks ago, describing about going nuclear, as it were, raising a lot of money in order to tackle Donald Trump and Melania, their claims against him. So it might be a different clip, but let's listen to what I have here. Now, that's can be the case with many friendships. However, the very few friendships would have photographs of your friend tucked away as your friend in a compromising position with stains on his suit. And you've seen these pictures, you more than anybody else.
Well, yes, but I'm not sure that that's true. I think these kinds of pictures, not my friends, but I think many people might have these kinds of semi-jocular, semi-comic, we're at a party, I don't know whatever the circumstance says, we're around the swimming pool. These are not taken in that moment of thinking that you're doing anything wrong, because you are just living your life, a life we have come to understand was problematic, to say the least, in so many ways. But at that moment, not. Just two guys, two playboys, this is what we do, this is who we are. Now, the fact that Epstein saved these pictures, I think that's a more difficult thing to analyze. But even when he took them out, when he showed them to me, it was in a spirit of kind of a mockery of Trump, of almost that these were kind of novelty pictures to be laughed at.
Right.
And at that moment in their relationship, at this point, if you laughed at Trump, Epstein would have been pleased about that.
Take us into that moment, though. So you're interviewing him, or you're meeting up with him, but it's part of an interview, if I'm not mistaken. And then how does he get to show you the pictures in the safe? What leads you up to that?
The background here is that in 2014, and I had known Epstein slightly before this. Epstein, I worked at New York Magazine. Epstein was part of a group of very rich men who tried to buy the magazine. Then they actually lost it to another even richer man. But so I had gotten to know Epstein during that period. And then Epstein went to jail, and I didn't know what happened to him. And only later, after he got out of jail, did he contact me. And then in 2014, we got together, and he wanted me to write about him. He was looking to be rehabilitated. And he said, yeah, I have had this problem, but I've done a lot of interesting things. I know a lot of interesting people. I think, yeah. And I told him I probably am not interested in this, but he said, no, well, don't worry about it. Whatever you want to do. But a lot of interesting people come to my house, and I'll invite you when I think that there's someone who you might like to hear or like to meet. And then you'll decide if you want to write about me. And we did this, and he did have interesting people there. And it was weirdly compelling. And I did think this is a strange and perhaps interesting life. But then in 2015, his old friend, Donald Trump, started to run for president. And that was unlikely at that point, continued to be unlikely. But then it rather seemed that it was slowly less unlikely. And I remember Epstein was the first person who said to me, Donald Trump is going to become the president of the United States. And I started to write about Trump at this point. And Epstein became a very helpful source. He was very insightful. He knew an enormous amount about Trump, was very insightful about Trump the man, was full of kind of shocking anecdotes about Trump's behavior. And that was in the context of this and me talking to him about Trump that he brought out these pictures.
I'm going to stop there because it's a long clip, but it's interesting. He is showing Michael Wolff photographs of of the president, of Donald Trump, with underage girls, or at least with young women, with all sorts of stains in places you wouldn't want to be seen publicly in. I think it was the Hawaiian Tropic girls were involved in that as well. These are the kind of photographs that he also bragged about having to Langdon Thomas when he was the New York Times journalist in his emails. These clearly exist or existed. Will they be detrimental to the president? Probably not, but depending on the age of the people involved. But this is an unusual situation where you got the president of the United States having these compromising photographs with someone who is an operative for foreign intelligence agencies and the mob and doing all sorts of unscrupulous things. For Michael Wolff to just laugh it off as this is just jocular is kind of interesting.
There's a lot of that in his emails. He was not a fan of Me Too. He didn't think it was a serious movement. He thought it was taking down all of his friends. They commiserated quite a bit about that. He was very good friends with with Woody Allen. That was a common friend between the two of them. He didn't really take a lot of this. He was just in the middle of this 90s New York City life as a journalist where all this stuff happened. And there was a view of women, and there was a view of modeling, and there was a view of wealthy men and what they were owed. And he was in there writing about it. And I don't think he really had much of a problem with it. This is not to say that Michael Wolff is involved in any of these underage sex crimes by any means. I don't think that he was, but I don't think in these conversations with Epstein, I don't think he really thought Epstein had done much wrong. I think he thought he was just a playboy, and boys will be boys. And this is just how you act if you're a wealthy, popular financial guy in the city. And I don't think he really had a problem with it. And if it's true, as he says, that these things are full of damning evidence about Donald Trump, if that's the only thing that's in these interviews, what are you waiting for? We are a second term and things are falling apart. Release it for that reason. What are we sitting on?
Exactly. Here we are looking at Michael Wolff's email to Jeffrey Epstein. This is dated 29th November 2016, looks like. What's I don't know if you've seen this one. Maybe this one is being stuck on you by surprise. But this is a back and forth between them. This is all about going out with Roger. Is that Roger Smith that they're talking? Roger. Which Roger is that they're talking about?
Well, there was also Roger Stone, but I don't think that's who they were talking about.
Having a bit of an idea if you have media, the Saudi friends involved there at the bottom. Thought you might be interested in this. This suddenly made me the only liberal media guy with access to Trump circles. I have a bit of an idea for your regarding media and Saudi friends. And then he says, I'm in Palm Beach. Is Roger here? So that must be Roger Stone, I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, he says, I think so. I'm here today, flying to New York tomorrow. If he's up for it, I'd love to sit with him, house or on plane, if you want to ride. I will ask how long in New York, and then they go on and on. So this is related to the Saudi person, maybe, in town. You'd mentioned the Saudi person in your article as well, right? There's a deputy crown prince.
Yes, it's the MBS. It's Mohammed bin Salman. It's the same guy who later on was murdering Jamal Khashoggi, who was a journalist for the Washington Post. Or was it Washington Post or Wall Street Journal?
Washington Post. And you're interesting if that is MBS. This is just before he became the crown prince, because 2016 he was still the deputy. That makes sense. And that is interesting that they were in contact with this guy. And of course, Epstein notoriously was friends with MBS for a long period of time. But this is all over. Just after the elections. It's quite something that they're having this exchange so soon.
Well, and there's a lot of pieces of this conversation that Michael Wolff is definitely digging into, because they're both a collector of people. I think they have similar qualities. They're both chameleons. They both can talk and entice the people they're in the room with, but they also are both people collectors. And Michael Wolff really wants to know certain people that Epstein knows. And so he digs a lot to get to know people or to meet people or to be on a plane with people. The Saudis are a big part of that.
And he says, I'm happy to go with him if he's shy. And then Michael Wolff says, he's not so much shy as paranoid. I have to contact him through his wife on a burner phone, which they don't reliably check. But I have queried. What an interesting line. He says, they came back to New York yesterday. He would like to meet the way of being seen, etc. I will work it out. And then it says, would you like
So
to...
wary of being seen. Yeah.
Wary of being seen. Would you like to ask him to have dinner tomorrow night? You, me, and Woody at my house. So that's
Woody. It has nothing to do with Woody Allen. They'll be like, oh, Woody's going to be at dinner. We're going to invite Andrew. We're going to invite the Crown Prince. We're going to invite Bill Clinton.
Then it says he believes New York Post photographs are following him, so he'd probably be too paranoid to come. That's really interesting, just to get a dig into their world, just to be able to witness what they're... There's another one here. This is from Steve Bannon to Michael Wolff. Can't make tomorrow. Can we reschedule for when he returns? And then Michael Wolff says, yes. Did you see the Prince in New York Times and DJT tweets on Corker?
Yeah.
Very integrated, right? Steve and Bannon going back and forth here, Jeffrey Epstein.
They were just very gossipy. They were very gossipy. All the three of them, they'd be like, I told you not to hang out with Andrew, so you better keep your distance. I told you about that guy. It's a lot of just, when the three of them are talking together, the academic level of the conversation goes way down. They've just become a bunch of dudes over beers. Michael Wolff kind of brings that up. If it's just him and Epstein, they start talking a little more eloquently. But as soon as Bannon's in the room, everything sort of goes downhill.
Yeah, he seems like he's that kind of guy. This is hard to see because it's not formatted properly, but this is Paul Krasner getting an email from Jeffrey Epstein on February the 16th, 2017. What's the context of this?
Okay, so Paul Krasner, I believe, was a professor at, I think it's ASU, and he was going through a scandal for being an alleged sexual offender of somebody, a student. And so Epstein was counseling him on how to deal with accusations of sexual abuse and how to get out of them and how to go on with your life. He was acting as a counselor. So there's a lot of conversations between the two of them. This one I just found to be really interesting because it feels like it's a little bit of a Freudian slip. They were talking about there was an alleged rape was reported to be at my house with Donald and I raping her. So they're talking about Katie Johnson. They're talking about that Katie Johnson case. Jeffrey Epstein goes, the allegation was not at a pedophile party. It was at my house with me.
Wow.
And then he goes, can I suggest you change that wording? Because he doesn't know, he didn't take this seriously. For whatever reason, the Katie Johnson thing, he just laughed his way through that whole process. He thought that was just not worth his time. But his wording around it starts to sound like, yeah, you did do this.
See, my analysis of that is that they did get a lot of... The first person when he found out about Katie Johnson's lawsuit was to contact Barak, Tom Barak. It was at the time the head of financing or campaign financing for Donald Trump. So he let them know right away there's a lawsuit coming, and then he engaged his lawyers right away, and he had a whole folder in his email box just dedicated to Katie Johnson. This is really interesting that he's saying the allegations was not at a pedophile party; it was at my house with me. And that sounds like saying it actually happened.
Sounds like an admission. But he was nervous about it because whenever there would be any kind of an article, I think there was one in maybe the New York Post or the Daily Mail, something that's more kind of tabloidy, came out that said that it was written to totally discredit Katie Johnson as a drug addict and a liar. Right. As soon as that came out, he sent that article to everyone. There's so many emails of him sending that article as a link to everybody he knows. He was trying to save himself a little bit. There was part of that was paranoia, but when he's talking to his close friends, he brushed it off. He just acted like it was just a joke.
Yeah, absolutely. He dismissed it and he used those articles which they had set up as a way of proving his innocence. This is all about Donald Trump, the real villain. Tell us what we're seeing here.
I just thought this one kind of summarized their whole relationship because it's talking about Jeffrey Epstein saying, do you think we highlight at the end of the day it was prostitution, sex for money, estate crime? This is about him redoing his image and Michael Wolff helping him
Right.
revamp his image. And there's that whole background of not necessarily Michael Wolff, but cleansing the internet of his history and just showing philanthropy and all the good things that he did. So this is where Michael Wolff is talking about ways for him to sound better. At this point, I don't think you can go legalistic. They've won the high ground, the young, the vulnerable, poor girls. And he said, I'm aware. I'm thinking what Trump would do. I'm gonna think about what Trump would do. He'd blame the media. And then it always winds back to Donald Trump. And for both of them, it seems that despite all these sexual accusations and all these things that are up in the air, it always comes back to their goals to take Trump down.
If he'd wanted to take him down, he had the means to take him down. I'm always surprised that we said that, but then didn't actually do anything about it. If he wanted to, he could have just said, hey, I raped this girl to the president. You would have lost the election right away. I think it was very useful to this network to have Donald Trump in the White House. And all they wanted was to have compromise on him so they could control him while he was in the White House. And I think they did that to a large extent. Let's talk about this. This is the algorithm, I've called it, that I think Epstein left behind. This is taken, the photo itself was taken right after his death. They went in there and they seized a lot of stuff. They took photographs. This is what it looked like. This is the redacted version. I don't know why it was redacted. The terms underneath it are not necessarily redactable, so it's a bit weird. But when I got the unredacted version and then did a lot of analysis around the words and what they appear to be saying, and this is what I came up with. Now, they're not identical to the writing. This is our own interpretation, but this is the words that we think are there. I spoke about this earlier on the 5 stack about what I think it is. I think it's basically algorithm for how to gain power through deception, and how he particularly targeted the financial, the physics world, the intellectual world, and the political world for that power. And he used the deception and he used spies, which I think is what plants are. I think plants are basically spies, or the girls. He used the term illusion and fear, which is interesting. And on the right there, this is how they did it. It's almost like a formula for how they did it, which is, I don't know what the formula means, but clearly music was an issue. They had various mixes, and then they had this combination, this like algorithm maybe, or this little formula for time, and then being either unconscious or dark consciousness, I guess is what they were trying to get at. And then this dark brain sort of being subversive, getting into people's lives by being deceptive so they don't know that they're being exposed in this way. That's my read on it. What did you think?
And then I had very little time. I read it through The Greatest Heist. I read it in your last chapter. But before that, I really hadn't seen a whole lot of this. I had seen the same pictures that everybody else saw that came out last week. I hadn't really thought a lot about what was on that chalkboard. I do know that he was very heavily involved with music. Music was one of the first things he ever did in his life. He was a very, very good musician. But what I could almost see this as being, and it would be interesting to if there was a way in the emails, which I feel there is, but a way in the emails to see who was on the island at the time this would have been written, is having a bunch of intellectuals in the room and almost having if we could take over the world, what would we do kind of a thing, where they're all adding their own 2 cents to this. I don't know if I see him in a room alone writing this. I see him writing it with people. And I don't know if that would be a Bannon thing. It's a very odd thing.
He's a math teacher, so he would have been accustomed to basically doing this on a blackboard in front of a class. And I agree with you. I think this is something he probably wrote down in front of other people. The reason why I'm really confident in what I'm saying is because this is exactly what he filed as his application to the Harvard Fellowship. Not exactly, but it's very similar to one to get his fellowship, although he barely attended Harvard in those 2 years. But his application involved the idea of deception, of using people as extensions of yourself, as prosthetics. And then at another time, he spoke about how all biology is about deception. He was a spy by craft, I believe, but he was also a student of what it means to deceive and how it is to deceive. And there's no doubt that he used that in the lives of many famous people, many well-known people, including Donald Trump, including Bill Clinton, including a lot of the people we've associated with him, like Andrew. This feels to me like it's the algorithm of how he did that, how he got there, the methodology. And then you led to the question of why do this? Why have a modeling agency? Why bring in all these women from Eastern Europe and all these other places? If you're not really that interested in them and they're just tools for something, what are they tools for? And it's very hard to escape that this is what they were tools for, that they were tools for gaining power, achieving that power that he wanted. And then, of course, he was going to use that many sinister ways, as we'll tell you in The Greatest Heist down the line.
I was going to ask you, did you feel like, having read some of these emails and the last emails to Bannon, because there's that, it's very eerie at the end when they're emailing each other on the plane as Epstein's flying back from Paris on the last day. Do you feel like he had, until he had that last little interaction with Bannon where he says cancel everything, do you feel like he knew?
I think he knew that this was coming. I think he knew that the arrest was coming. And I think he left this on the board there on purpose. I don't know when he last visited there, but it would be interesting to know. But I think he left it there as a calling card. The person who arrested him was none other than Bill Barr under his Justice Department. So,
which is ironic. The beginning and the end.
Yeah. This is a picture of Bill Barr when they met. He had just finished high school, Bill Barr, and his dad and Epstein started working for his dad at the Dalton School. Yeah. And Bill Barr was almost immediately a CIA guy. And it's interesting that Epstein also crossed paths with the CIA in Ohio with Wexner and Air America. So you got it's an interesting that they've known each other all this time, almost all their adult life. And he's the one who lands up arresting, that's his Justice Department that lands up arresting Jeffrey Epstein. I wonder if he got a tip off. I wonder if he knew anything. I wonder if he knew why he was being arrested. This is just a really interesting story.
You felt they do get more coded in their conversations, him and Bannon, because he and Bannon talk more than everybody else. But they get much more coded in the last 6 months, I would say. And he starts to kind of live vicariously through Bannon as Bannon's traveling around the world and speaking to world leaders, because I think he became more isolated, knowing that he was under surveillance, which he's mentioned in those emails. Bannon will start to say something and he'll say, we can't say that on email. Go call me right now. Give me a call or we'll say that in person. So he knew something was happening, but I don't think on that specific plane ride he knew that was the day necessarily. But
it's hard to say. If he'd known, maybe he wouldn't have come. It's so fascinating. It's such an interesting story. We're going to find out a lot more in the next 8 days. Ellie and I will be covering this on our various Substacks. Ellie, tell me what you got plans, because you got lots more Epstein stuff coming up. I
am running as fast as I can to finish up these last few pages of files from the last dump, because I've gone through them one at a time, just make sure I'm not missing anything. And I know this next file is coming. So every time I get an alert on my phone from the House Oversight Committee, I panic a little bit. But it's always
on Friday as well.
Be Christmas Eve or something. I'm really just pushing to finish up these emails that I have. I'm assuming there's going to be a whole bunch of more emails in this next drop. Really interested in the Kathy Rumor emails and what kind of relationship she really had with Epstein, which is a little bit odd. The Ken Starr stuff is so strange. His relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and the way that he interacts with him is just like it's like a Southern belle. I don't know how to describe it. He's just so
taken.
I don't know. He's like Judy Garland. It's like Judy Garland is Tom Chick.
It's so odd. The Ken Starr thing is so contradictory. He went after Monica Lewinsky full force and with all that moral righteousness, and then he's best friends with Jeffrey Epstein. It just makes no sense.
I'm working on that, and then I'm just sort of gathering information right now. I'm in the gathering phase. I might write one article on Donald Trump, some of this health stuff, because I have my own interpretation of what's going on, which all people do right now. Mostly I'm just researching. I'm just soaking up this information, spitting it out, making it easy to read, and then waiting for the next shoe to drop.
I think next Friday, if anything gets released, and I'll be surprised if it does, it's going to be huge, regardless of what it is. That probably, with all these things, will be a little underwhelming for most people, because we've already exposed so much about Jeffrey Epstein that the actual files release might seem a little underwhelming, but we're just what's in them. And
I'm
don't know what's
hoping for a lot of digital stuff. I'm hoping for a lot of photos and videos and those things that we haven't had up to this point, but we've heard about. I'm hoping there's a lot more of that in
I think a lot of that is being cleaned out. There was one directory of 4 discs of so-called videos of people with young women. Only the 4th one is left behind. And it says it's the 4th one. 3 or more have been taken.
He was tipped off when his house is being raided. He was tipped off. Hard drives went missing and computers went missing. And I'm sure there's a lot of stuff. I wonder if they went back to the estate or if they were destroyed, or I don't know. I don't know where these things are.
There was FBI evidence that said that a lot of it was removed. There are other copies of it, but I think that the stuff that was taken out of his house was probably never going to see the light of day again. It would be my guess for some of that stuff. But we'll see. We'll see what we get. There's terabytes of information, or at least 300 gigabytes of information that will come next Friday. Everyone should please subscribe to Ellie Leonard's incredible work. Look, your article was a good take on it. It may not be everyone's opinion. He certainly has defended himself in many ways, saying he's doing the job of a writer and he got the story that everybody wanted and he's the one who got it. And it's true. There's no other writer who's been able to get inside the Trump White House and inside Epstein's life the way Michael Wolff has. But he's very inside. Now, you might say that compromises him. You might say that involves him in actual criminal activity. But he got the story and he got the books and he got the sales, and you can't argue with that. That is reality. And if Michael's watching, you're welcome to come back on Narrative and we'll be happy to talk to you about it. And there's lots to talk about Michael. He certainly has so much information. He's got hundreds of hours of Epstein on tape. We have to get that tape. It's really important we all find out about it. The Panicked writer, Ellie Leonard, thank you for being here today. You must subscribe to her. You must follow her. You must give her a paid subscription because she now accepts those. Yeah. You can also check out the Greatest Heist Book 2. Chapter 5 is called The Lair. It's at narrative.org under the Greatest Heist tab. It's a long read. It's a difficult read in some ways, but it does give you the insight into that blackboard. It gives you an insight into how the espionage operation worked, how the modeling agencies tied in, how the Russian and Israeli pipeline tied in, how Barak ties in. It's my attempt to sort of give you the whole thing that was shut down by Ken Starr during the investigation in 2008. I try to reveal as much as was known at that time about that operation. So it gives you a real insight into how things worked.
It makes a great audiobook, I will say. I've been listening to it as I fold laundry. Oh, yes, absolutely.
Great. I should read it as an audience for. But it's a good read, and it's the dialogue is really, for me, the most interesting because it's taken from actual court documents. These are actual exchanges between people. It's reconstructed as dialogue in the real world, but it's the actual words, and it gets you so close into his relationship with Jess Staley as well, which I thought was just, even having done it, just when I read it back, I think it's so interesting, the conversations they had about a health scare and about getting the results. What was going on?
Yeah, he's like your financial guy and you're calling him about, very personal things.
Yeah. So they're very good friends. So everyone should check that out. Thanks everyone for being here tonight on this special edition of Narrative Live as we count down 8 days till Jeffrey Epstein's deadline, the deadline for the FBI files. Thanks, Ellie. Have a great night.
Yeah, you have a good night too. Bye.